Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts on this beautiful summer afternoon in 2017. So today, we're going to talk about God. And I'm not sure exactly how to name this because I've got a few ideas. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the factors behind God, but we're going to laser in on one assertion that drives me crazy. It doesn't actually drive me crazy. I mean, I don't lose control, but it's one of these debates that I feel like is the most de facto moment where man, it goes one step beyond ignorant and two steps into stupid. And that is to accuse God, if there is one, of being angry. Because that one turn in his character design in our minds drives a huge portion of anyone who touches a religion. Before we go there, though, let's think about this. If there's a God, then there's you and there's a God. And whatever other things that God has bestowed upon you, perhaps if you believe he gave his only son, and then you believe there's this other ethereal cloud stuff called the Holy Spirit. I don't know why he's got to be all subdivided before he can be accepted. It's so strange. But fear is the only reason why the Bible exists. Do you realize that? Now you might immediately contest and say, hey dude, but you've said there is the moral code of society inside this, and that's what we need to preserve out of it, and I'm not going to backtrack on that statement. But I think that is actually driven by fear. If you don't follow the code, you go to fire and brimstone place. For the Old Testament, if you didn't sacrifice a lamb inside of a multi-chambered temple where the blood could go underneath the walls and spill out into the streets, and everyone goes, hooray, you were going to hell. Jesus comes around, supposedly, and he absolves the sheep and says, look, just accept the Father, my Father, our Father, me, by proxy, and you'll be forgiven. Original sin, right? What the serpent told humans. I have a friend of mine who I have these sort of tongue-in-cheek arguments with about the wrath of God and the anger of God, and it's like playing one turn of chess at a time. To have these shallow thoughts that God could be angry. That means when you play chess, you play one, maybe not even one step ahead. Let's think about it. How many living beings exist? I don't give a shit where you think they exist. The universe, some firmament dome, multiple firmament domes, infinite, whatever. There's a lot of us out here, right? But let's just take the earth, right? So if God can get mad, then scientifically speaking, God is one pissed off dude constantly, because there's always an asshole out there creating a reason to make someone angry, right? And I don't mean to seem irritated during this episode, but I do think it's frustrating. What is anger? What is it? In my experience, it's been when I didn't, well, it's actually one of two things. I expected a thing to happen and it didn't happen. Perhaps we agreed that this is what should happen and it didn't happen. Perhaps we were going to commit to something together, some sort of relationship, some sort of business deal, some sort of, hey, meet me at the grocery store. And then something happened that I didn't expect. You told a lie. You didn't show up. Whatever, you weren't faithful to the relationship. But the way that a human gets angry is by sheer surprise. It is. So how is God, all knowledgeable, able to hold the universe together, never makes a mistake, right? The program of the universe never fails. Ever, ever, ever. We glorify God inside rooms. I don't care if you're more leaning towards an atheist belief system, but you do believe that there's a central consciousness. You typically always give the creator, or even creators, the intellectual credit of holding this place together. That's who we're talking about here, right? We're not talking about anything else but the creator. So why make a whole episode about that? Aren't I finished? Isn't that pretty simple? Do we need to elaborate for another 50 minutes? What I want to get into is we're encouraged to think that we can't understand God, right? They say don't even try to understand God, but who the hell tells us that shit? A preacher tells us that first, and then our grandparents repeat it, and our parents repeat it, and then as we get older, everybody repeats it. But God works in mysterious ways, they said on Come Fly With Me. We're encouraged to be ignorant because if one sits down and thinks this thing through for a split second, with a certain level of base intelligence, obviously, you will come to the conclusion that you're being had by man. Anyone defining God is basically blowing smoke up your ass. They want to control you, right? And if you think that that's not the truth, let's think about this. How is it that so many Catholic preachers have molested and had sex and tortured boys? How is that possible? Because the parents will do anything to cleanse their ignorant minds through this horrible construct called the Catholic Church. The very church itself absolutely defies the Bible if you were to believe it, right? One man has been given the key from Christ where they fake this fucking painting so they could get control over mankind and then keep everyone ignorant by saying don't try to understand God, or you just got to have faith or something like that. But now how is it that all these old pasty dudes have had all this access to boys? We're talking thousands and thousands of boys, probably tens of thousands, if not a million boys since the beginning of this horrific thing in the Vatican. It's because someone fears God that you would go to this institution and then put your children into it. And the more you wave goodbye, Billy, with the preacher, putting his hand on your kid, you feel like you're saving yourself by putting your kids into this ancestral, bizarre pedophilia meat grinder. Because you fear God. Because you have to go to a church to get saved. Right? Only these wise men understand God and His nature for wrath. And so if you want to get to heaven, there's this eye of the needle that's created by Christianity and other religions to get there. But let's rewind for a second. How many of you were baptized as adults? If you're Catholic, you get baptized as a kid. I was raised in a Catholic family for about 8 years. But then I chose to get baptized, I think, around 19. And when I did, the church wanted me to read everything in the Bible about baptism, Peter's baptisms, and all of Christ's words about being baptized and why one gets submerged in water and all this interesting, neat stuff. But the theme of baptism, and the theme of every Bible thumper who knocks on your door, is God's infinite forgiveness. Christ's infinite forgiveness. Right? That goes out of the left side of their mouth. Now, if you sit down and you refuse to join their church and refuse to get baptized for the 19th time, right? Doesn't matter if you were baptized yesterday by Church A. If Church B shows up, they're the only ones with the authority to baptize you, and so they got to get rebaptized, right? But out of the right side of their mouth, they're telling you, well, if you don't get baptized under our command, then you're going to hell. because God is a prick. Now, could you imagine actually dying and even a portion of the existence of God is true, and you've been spending your whole life on this planet teaching fear of God, teaching wrath of God, teaching hell and damnation, teaching everyone that you have the drop on how God's mind works, but don't think about him because he works in mysterious ways, right? This absolute paradoxical doublespeak within the brain of a human being. And somehow when you pass away, you float to the center of this universe and you join sort of the beautiful star that is God's consciousness. And you have to admit that the entire time you were alive, you were essentially demonizing God and calling him names to other human beings. And even though you've reached this beautiful apex of total forgiveness because there is no wrath, you are allowed into the presence of God. Maybe you join God. Hell, who knows what happens, right? But there is no, punishment on the other side. Repenting is automatic and inverted because when you discover what you did, you live out your own punishment. But perhaps God is even more forgiving than that and removes your stupidity and your bias given to you by your relatives, given to you by your neighbors, and you're just cleansed back to pure consciousness. But you left a bunch of people behind completely confused. You retarded their ability to join society and be happy because now they're worried about a hell, damnation, right? I have rarely heard of a definition of God that remotely takes into account the basic principle of infinity, that takes the statement of infinite forgiveness and moves it into the world of any religion. There's Middle Eastern religions that say most of the world is infidels. Judaism, well, it's just one of the smallest populations on the planet. Some who are actually religious within that, and very few, I should say, believe they're the chosen ones and that the rest of us aren't chosen. As if that's the way God works. He plays favorites. Interesting, right? It must feel amazing to convince yourself that you're some special tribe from God and everyone else are idiots, right? But that's all religions. No one could pick on one religion. That's what they all do. They're elitists. And now we have scientific elitism, of course, but we can't go down that because that doesn't have a God element to it. There's a whole train of thought that I have been practicing for I don't know how many years, but I'm sure that a lot of you have done it too, and you probably do it on a daily basis, which is the following. I made an episode about The Answer. It's called The Answer. I believe it's in season 1. And in that episode, I assert that we're here to live. We're here to live our lives, and as I've said in recent episodes, not be trivial and that sort of thing. But if nothing else, we're here to live. But because of religion getting installed into our mind to have man control man, and perhaps man needs to be controlled because man is sort of out of control at various stages of education and repression, it's almost like we can fall back on religion when everything goes, rule of the law of the jungle. And so we can kind of say, okay, turn up religion because we're losing control of society. It is a fictitious construct, but it's a construct and it can help keep people from going crazy. Maybe that's the genius of Titus Flavius creating this thing in the first place. I think he was doing it to save a nickel for Rome. But one of the things you can do, or one of the things you might already be doing, is preparing yourself to meet your God. And I don't mean, like you're actively living in some heroin mod suicide loop. I just mean when and if it occurs, because it will happen, when you transcend, whether it be tomorrow or when you're 100 years old, you want to have a clean track record of thinking. And what I think is very interesting is, again, you have to be a certain level of gullibility, or gullible, You have to have a certain level of gullibility to fall for this stuff. to let someone else tell you something. But the problem, or the way that it gets into your system, is that they hit you when you're so young that you have no defense. You have very little faculties, very little education. Some families are very militant about it. When I was a kid, if you didn't, not in my family, but one of my good friends, every single time they did something wrong, their mother forced them to read the Bible and find a passage that says they shouldn't have done it. But they always got the belt before and I think after. And the mom did it. She looked like a really large version of the psychic from Poltergeist. Now, I'm sure her kids grew up fairly well behaved, hopefully. But think about the paradigm of religion in those kids' lives. They were tortured with it. A Bible meant there's a 50-50 chance your ass is getting swatted for doing something wrong. The only other time you'd see it is if you went to church on a Sunday and then you weren't in trouble. I've had a saying for a very long time, and it's very simple. I'm sure people have said it in many different ways throughout the centuries. But when God starts being defined as man, that definition is usually wrong, and it's usually by man. Right? If you can have the wherewithal and the courage to give God a definition that is actually tangible, yet truly unlike man, with infinite understanding, infinite patience, infinite love, let's just say, infinite consciousness, I would say we're then approaching the realm of definition of a God. Let's go to the Garden of Eden real quick here. Now, I'll just put a footnote in. If this is your first episode, I have a belief system that, being a script writer myself, having a serpent be the main character of the first chapter of Genesis and being the key pivotal character of which Eve spoke to, and then Adam inherited the speech, and that blew apart the entire equation of this metaphorical place called Eden. You've been had by the devil, if it's true. He's the one that talked. Cast a spell on mankind, an evil spell that makes man believe that man is original sin. That then we have to kiss ass of man, of which, if there is a devil, he can only control man. He can't control God, right? Now, I'm not into any of this stuff. I don't believe any of that crap's real. But just let's look at the story of Eden. Because this is where God initially gets pissed off. One, God is so feeble-minded that he gets lonely and he makes man. Now, the initial story is that God may have been lonely and he made man. That very well may be an emotion that God can feel. Let's hope now he feels like he has a big giant family. But he creates this garden, and the garden is perfect. And he puts two flawed beings in it, and he puts an apple tree. And he gives man a perfect rule, because rules are perfect by design. They don't have usually areas where they're bent. Don't eat of the apple unless you really want to, and then you can have one every week. All right, every day. Okay, every hour. I want you to slice it, put peanut butter on it, right? But now, let's look at the mathematical certainty of what's going on here. And I've had some ignorant-ass observations on this from friends of mine that I will share with you. Man is now destined to eat an apple because man has not been made perfect. Because if man was perfect, he wouldn't, let's just say you want to go the sex of man, male versus female. Maybe someone wants to insinuate, I've never heard this, but females are flawed, so she eats of the apple, and she's able to wiggle her deception into man. I've never heard that. Both of them were equally flawed. Eve talks to the devil, and the devil takes over the narrative of the entire Bible from start to finish, baby. Now, they eat this apple, and God's got to be a dick. He's got to put an apple tree in the Garden of Eden and tell them not to eat of it. Why would he do that? Doesn't that sound like I am just trying to bait you? I have created a mechanism by which I know you will fail. Someone might insinuate that God wanted to humble man to make sure man knew that he was lesser than God, because of course he has an ego and he's a narcissist, right? I don't think that there was any mystery if there was an Eden that for man to realize that there was a greater force, if this was ever true, right? Man can't do things that God just did. And God's hanging out, by the way. He's hanging out. So you get to see him. You get to experience your insignificantness to him. But you also would get to experience his infinite love. So there's no need to humble man. But there's this apple thing. And then God shows up. Like he's a drama queen. He has literally instigated a situation where he gets to be a drama queen. Right? Comes down and queens all over these guys that, oh my God, I can't believe you ate this. Let me roll out the red carpet of total punishment for you. And from this point on, because a woman ate an apple, the rest of all their siblings are doomed. Would you like to go meet God and tell God that you believe that that's true? Really? Because all you're saying is, well, I think you're an asshole. The only reason why you would ever bring that up and believe it and not think he's an asshole is because, or admit that you think he's an asshole, is because you fear his wrath as a result of telling God that you think he's an asshole. So you grovel. You don't think it was fair that an apple was the catalyst for man being saddled with original sin, right? All of our parents have made mistakes before we were born. Would you really think that you should be born underneath the sin of your father or the sin of your mother? Doesn't have to be a big sin. Sin. Anything. They ate the cake they weren't supposed to eat. They told a little white lie. Should you be saddled with that? Why? Who would make a universe that would do that? Oh yeah, an asshole would make the universe like that. And so if you believe that original sin can be carried from human to human, then that's what you're insinuating. Now, I've been mentioning this a couple times. I just want to throw this in there. I've said several times in recent episodes that when you find a bug in software, if you're an engineer of software, a tester, when you're a child and you're young and you find bugs, you don't even want to report them because you don't want to be in trouble. It's not even your bug. You're not the coder. But you don't want to find bugs. You want pure success, pure perfection with no effort. But as you mature and become an adult, finding a bug is exactly what you know you're supposed to do, and it's a victory. So if Adam and Eve eating the apple is what they're not supposed to do, well, then it would be a bug. And at an adult level, you'd be like, oh, wow, yeah. I see. I made her weak in this one area, and he's weak to her, and so, yeah, let's fix that on her. Let's, get a little ratchet out here, get the 5/16 here and fix him. And then let's restart the simulator, put the apple back on the tree, get this fucking snake out of here. That's not God, though. God is the child. God is literally a big, fat, crying baby, according to religion, who picks, one race needs to die, another race gets to be supreme. Have fun telling God all about that when you get there, right? There's all these passages in the Old Testament where God proves to man, or basically demonstrates through sheer bullying, that you're to put him over everything else, as if that was a mystery. A father being told to kill his son. Wow. Like I've said in several episodes, the son would be utterly traumatized for the rest of his life, and the father would be traumatized for the rest of his life. And God, in that scenario, would be no different than a mafia coming to get protection money from you, bullying you into shit you don't want to do. And just because he pulls back at the last second and says, I'm just kidding, You guys live with the psychosis of me making you try to kill your son, and son, your father. Now when you see him, you're going to completely fear your father for the rest of your life. There's no respect there. There's just terror. And I did that. That's what I do because I'm God, right? Imagine this whole thing where we live in a world now, since we have the printing press and cameras in everyone's phones, God doesn't show up that much anymore, does he? We don't have messiahs falling out of the sky constantly now, right? And the only thing we have are religions that say that God has either left behind the instructions about how to kill everyone else but your tribe, which is most religions outside of Christianity. Christianity kind of thinks the same thing, but Christianity says that the Son of God, which some people think is God, which is weird, is coming back, and we're always living in a 24/7, 365 sort of end of times. Nobody realizes that if you just keep going back in history and keep reading about the cultural sort of crazies that walked around, New York City or London with these sort of sandwich boards on their chest saying, it's the end of the world is coming. Those kooks always exist. Always. It doesn't matter where we are in society, as long as Christianity exists, there will always be end of time people. Now, what I've never seen, and maybe you guys can enlighten me, I've never seen a Jewish person walk around with that information on their chest, or a Muslim person walk around with that. It's just a Christian thing. And the idea is they're selling the fear of God. Get your shit together, man, because God's coming back, and boy, is he going to be pissed, right? If God is so pissed, and if God is, indicative of flooding the earth, that's a whole nother thing, right? God allows the world to get... First, he creates such a flawed man that man is unable to be educated and to remember anything that they've been educated to know. And so the world gets completely out of control, and he gets completely pissed. But he does pick one guy, Noah, and his wife and his cousins and his brothers and all that shit. And they're, building this big giant ark, which, by the way, in recent months, the shape of the ark has completely changed. It went from the ark that we've always seen, which is sort of the round bucket thing, the one they just rebuilt in, Norway or somewhere. It's probably wrong, but they built one in a dock just recently, and now a bunch of people are like, no, it was a square box. I've been hearing the square box theory. Pretty funny. That'd be a fucking great hull, wouldn't it? You just sit around and float in the ocean. You wouldn't have any way to guide yourself because the hull isn't, built for moving left or right or forward, backwards, right? But he gets so pissed off that he picks one guy to handle the whole thing, man. And I guess God is the one that's bringing all the pairs, the genetic pairs into this thing. Because God actually fixes the problem according to the mechanics of man at Noah's time. What would you do in Noah's time? That, Noah never existed, but in that time frame, what do you got? Well, just like UFO stories always happen to match the current science fiction that was written, or sci-fi that was written in its era, so too are the parables and stories about God. Build a boat, then I'll flood it for 40 days and 40 nights. Because God's got to work in completely conventional means and not be godlike. He's got to be manlike. Oh, but you might contest, but flooding the seas, who could do that besides God? Well, that is sort of a big idea for the time in which that story was crafted. But are you telling me that God didn't know about Star Wars in Noah's time? He didn't know about Blade Runner and all these crazy science fiction things and all the amazing films and inventions that are coming? He couldn't have done it in a more modern way. He has a guy build a boat out of wood, impossibly small to hold all the shit they said was in there, and possibly small to probably carry just the food supply for all those animals and the humans in there. Miraculously, he fed their bellies or something. It's not in the story. But this is something that people bring up to define God, to make him fit inside a man-made box. So that, there's just a tidbit of, supernatural, but the rest of it is something we can understand, and it all vectors down into one downtick at the end of the stories, right? They always have downticks. Fear God. God is angry. God is an asshole. Because that's what you're saying. The second you say God can be angry, he becomes an ignorant being that doesn't have infinity as a part of his makeup. An angry God would be angry all the time, right? Because there's someone always sinning against God according to whatever religion you follow. There's more sinners for some religions than good people. But regardless, God, what happens when you get pissed off? Let's think about this for 1 second. I know I'm belaboring this, but it's good to just see it from a bunch of different angles so you can finally, completely, and utterly reject any assertion that whatever God you want to believe in has a man-made flaw in him. How many of you can think straight when you're pissed off? How many of you are your best when you're pissed? I'm going to wager, without knowing any of you, none of you are. When you're angry, your circuits are going crazy, you're confused, you feel betrayed. All your electrical systems in your human core are just on fire. Maybe you're yelling, maybe you're shouting, maybe you're fighting. Maybe you're silent. You're angry and you're silent. Now hopefully there's a bit of a recourse to your soul that you should say, well, as ignorant as it is for me to accuse God of being angry, I should probably try not to be angry myself. Easier said than done, right? But anger preoccupies your consciousness. So you take God, who's responsible for all this stuff that we see, if God exists. If God were to be preoccupied with something, wouldn't part of the universe fade out of existence? Wouldn't we go into pause while he throws a fucking tantrum somewhere? Destroying some planet because it didn't follow his rules, because he made a bunch of flawed creatures? And he's really punishing the creatures for his own frailty and his own lack of knowledge. Except we've got proof that he doesn't make any mistakes. This program runs beautiful, right? There may be an organic element if you're a Mandela effect person, but I wouldn't say that would be a flaw, even if that exists. It's just probably more nebulous. Time might be more nebulous. Our consciousness may flow between frequencies of time. And for whatever reason, a whole giant herd of us go to the universe where it's, no, I'm your father, instead of Luke, Luke, I'm your father. But what happens with the universe and your religion the second that you accept for 1 second that God has never been angry in his entire existence? What happens? What do you have to eject out of your belief system if you can give God the credit of being truly infinitely smart, infinitely patient, infinitely forgiving, etc., etc., etc.? Well, I think the very first thing you have to do is pretty much divorce yourself from any religion that's trying to define God as such. If you can find a religion that doesn't attempt to define God, Buddhism is pretty good, right? Then maybe you can keep it. I don't think I have a lot of Buddhists that watch the show. I think I have a lot of folks that know about it, some people that do worship it or believe in it as a mantra. But you're talking about a human who may have transcended in some manner, and hell, maybe that's true, since I think we all do transcend. Perhaps if someone meditates and gains control over themselves, they have a little more free reign. But for those who believe in the Charlton Heston Jesus, it may be time to adjust. So now, let's think about this. What am I doing to religion? The fear that someone might have, a religious scholar, would be, do not spread the rumor that God isn't wrathful, because that's the only way we control humanity. And if you tell humanity that God is ever forgiving and isn't wrathful, then man will just turn back into the jungle. That's where we disagree, if you believe that. Because man has enough anger against injustice to handle the situation. There must have been a time very similar to 2001: A Space Odyssey, the first act, where Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke told the story of the monkeys at the very beginning. For those of you who haven't seen it, it goes something like this. There's two tribes of monkeys. One tribe has access to a water hole. It's just a real shallow little collection of water, probably 20 feet in diameter, maybe 8 inches deep. But it's water. It's what they need to exist. But the monkeys hadn't. It's like prehistoric men. It's kind of like it's mime actors inside these suits, which is to this day pretty damn phenomenal looking. But they don't have any weapons. All they do to scare each other, to fight wars, is to yell and scare each other and just try to intimidate. There's no punching, there's no grabbing, there's no nothing. It's just yelling and screaming. But what happens at the beginning is this monolith shows up, which is an alien computer, and starts teaching one of the tribes about weapons, the ability to defend oneself, sort of implying that there's a justice scale that's being also introduced at the same time as a subtextual thing. Because the first group, they got scared away from the water hole by the second group. In our minds, we say finders keepers, right? And so in the story, it's sort of dramatized that the second tribe should go find their own water hole. In the end, they should probably share, right? But there's one alpha male in each tribe. The monolith keeps talking to these through singing, this crazy, amazing singing soundtrack that Kubrick had managed to put together. And he grabs a bone off of a dead carcass. It's like a thigh bone. And he starts just having fun, just kind of moving it and playing, and he realizes he can hit a rib cage bone and it flips, and he's like, well, that's cool, and keeps going to the point he realizes that this thing is like a weapon and you can crush bones with it, and he goes absolutely nuts. And the first thing that they do is he kills a boar and eats its flesh, because up to that point they were vegetarians. And then he teaches all the other ones in the tribe to do it, and they all start eating meat, and they all start getting aggressive and more intelligent. They go back to that water hole. But the other tribe hasn't had the benefit of a monolith teaching them the next stage of growth. And he tries to just wave his arms and scare the other alpha male. But our alpha male in the story brought a bone, and so did everyone else in his tribe, at least the males. And he proceeds to beat the shit out of the other alpha male from the other tribe, and they take that hole back, and he feels the glorious power of righteousness. He gets the water hole back for his kind, and his seed continues, and he throws the bone in the air, which turns into a spaceship, which advances us into the main narrative of the movie. I think that we have benefited from intellectualizing common law to a really sweet spot. We do have a dilemma that we don't teach classes about morality, and if the left has its way, there will be no definition of morality. They just push someone on CNN to be all butthurt and cry, and then we just have to absolve rape. Rape's going to be okay, you know. The EU is doing a really good job of erasing the laws of the land. Murder's okay in the EU, as long as a Muslim does it. Raping of a child's okay, as long as a Muslim does it. Raping anyone's okay, really. So if you do believe in an evil force and a positive force, Europe is in a fucking death spiral until they take the place back. So let's go to the next part of the debate. If God is not wrathful, then what's going on this planet? Doesn't it seem like bad people run the planet? We know there's a bunch of child trafficking going on at the politician level. Was it Kofi Annan, who ran the United Nations? His son was literally in charge of the food for sex scandal in Africa. Top dogs breeding, horrible children. But boy, he looked dapper in that nice tight suit, didn't he? He had a British accent, which made us think he was smart and compassionate. But his own flesh and blood is responsible for countless babies probably being born in Africa, but at least a giant portion of people who needed food in Africa now being rape victims. So if God has infinite compassion, where is he? Don't we want a God that has wrath, that would come down and take these assholes out? Why is George Soros still alive? I think if God was wrathful, you wouldn't see any of the stuff that's going on today. And we would probably be robots. I don't mean that literally. How many times have you watched a movie or a TV series where there's a king or someone who's in charge, a gang leader, whatever, and everyone's kissing that person's ass? Because if they don't, that person kills them. There's always a threat that has to be reinforced, to rule by fear. I don't experience that, do you? The only time that anyone ever makes me think that is when they're usually religious. And they're trying to convince me that God is that way. But what's really interesting about the whole thing is, and I've got a friend of mine who's very religious. He's an amazing, amazing human being. But what ends up happening in the room is the second that they think that you don't believe what they believe, which is a wrathful God, they sort of turn into this paladin. Across the room, they are the ones with the authority to tell you how it works, and therefore, in the room, they become sort of a mini pope, a mini disciple of Christ, and they feel amazing. They feel their chest puff up because they're the only ones with the answers about how to have your soul saved, about what you can and can't do. But if you lined up 10 of these people who feel all righteous and you had them debate among themselves, here's a piece of paper and a pen, write down everything that you agree that we have to do over here as infidels in order to pass through the eye of the needle to your God, your wrathful, immature Bam Bam, they wouldn't be able to agree. Well, they might have a few, maybe 3 to 5 they might be able to agree on, maybe. But the severity of the punishment would be argued. What matters and what doesn't matter would be argued. But let's go down the other avenue. Some of you are very familiar with the phrase, I gave them enough rope to hang themselves. And that's usually where one quadrant of these sort of, God is evil, God is wrathful, God is immature folks lean on. They go, well, God's just giving you all the rope you want. At the end of your life, when Judgment Day comes, you'll be hung. You'll be judged. You're going to go to that really dark fire and brimstone place, right? In the end, however that's insinuated, that's the same exact model that we've been talking about the entire time. Now, some of you may have stories in your life that you lean on when it comes to proving to yourself God's wrath or God's existence or hell's existence or something like that. Again, hell doesn't have to be fire and brimstone to be pretty bad. Have you ever been in a place you just didn't want to be and you felt like that weird irritation on your skin, on your body that you wanted to leave? Perhaps it was a loud restaurant. Perhaps it was a really rambunctious, ignorant crowd where everyone's just feeding on a Black Friday morning, right? Trampling old people because they have no goddamn empathy anymore. And you're just like, this is wrong. If there's a devil, he's orchestrating this moment. Well, that could be hell. Very simple. I don't think anyone who's ever been in an isolation tank would define it as anything other than hell. Because even though it might be protecting them against predators outside, they're still not free. They're not able to engage the gifts that they've been given. Their mortal coil is a waste. Their mind is a waste, just sitting in there rotting. So hell could be very primitive. But there are these videos online that are pretty interesting about people that used to worship Satan, and there's at least 2 of them out there that if you listen to their testimonies about this whole thing, it's very elaborate, it's very biblical, very man-made, But they will have gone down a path. It's almost, there's just two of them, and they go down to these paths where they claim to have ruled over certain principalities, which is what the Satan churches call them, various regions of the world, states, towns, counties, whatever. And the way that they talk about it being organized is that within a particular county, there's a person, some warlock or whatever the hell you call them, that determine who live and die in those areas. Messages are passed between counties, and so someone could say, there's a guy in your county that's messing with a guy in my county, we want him dead. And so they'll do all these rituals, and they claim all this success. I mean, they claim it to a point we could prove it in a laboratory, which obviously can't be true. But they'll talk about certain people they try to kill that are very faith-based and very Christian-based, and they're untouchable. One guy from New York said that he tried to kill this old lady, and the devil himself said, we can't touch her. She's protected because she's so religious. That's pretty compelling if you believe that, right? But he said he talked to the devil, did all these rituals. He was raised into it by his parents. And then on one particular day, he went to hell. I can't remember exactly what the scenario was, but I remember when he said he went to hell, he went to a fire and brimstone place, and it's every Hollywood, every biblical definition for the last 1,500 years of what hell is. People being boiled alive, burning, just constant screaming and suffering, blah, blah, blah. And he's sitting in hell, and all of a sudden he sees Christ in hell. And Christ says, well, I'm basically a Charles Dickens novel, and I want you to see what it's like as sort of a Christmas future. You get your shit together, you get afraid, and I'll bring you back, and you can be reborn, because I'm infinitely forgiving, right? Now, luckily for this guy, he did pull out of devil worshipping and became reborn, and even if that's not true, it's a hell of a lot better than living a life believing that you're killing people. Like, who knows? Maybe the guy was just a mass murderer and you don't know. But there's at least two stories like that. And when you hear that, and you hear these really elaborate recollections of their entire life, you can be through repetition, right? Repetition is where the mind can absorb the most absurd concept, which is why you must be very careful with any conspiracies that you hear. On this show, I try to keep everything rounded. I try to keep both sides represented. And so we go through both scenarios. I have my biases, as you can tell in this episode. But I try not to create, ones where I am controlling you or you're being controlled by someone else. I'm trying to imbue you with logic such that you control you. And in the end, I'm not sure where that could ever be construed as evil. But when you hear these stories, they get you thinking. You might even be outside of Christianity and you've never even heard of Christ, but you start hearing these stories and you start getting afraid. Depending on your intellectual capacity to really put yourself into the scenario and say, that's a nice story, dude. Maybe you psyched yourself out and you saw things through whatever means, taking drugs or whatever, and you took your precepts, right? Your fictitious understanding of the universe, and you injected them into a vision, and you wanted out of this negative death spiral of your life going to complete waste, and you pulled yourself out and you latched onto something that is unequivocally better, which is Christianity over devil worshipping. At least with Christianity, you get some morals, right? You get a chance to follow the law. You're supposed to be good. You're supposed to be giving and forgiving, right? Something that I guess God struggles with, You're supposed to do it perfectly every single day, otherwise you can't go into heaven. But your God, he can totally lose his shit and kill man constantly or cause horrific things to happen to man. Remember what I said in the stress episode. The more stressed you are, the less your peripheral vision works to take information in. It forces you to be unenlightened, right? What you're supposed to do is see everything in as many dimensions as you possibly can. Spirituality being the 21st century renaissance that's actually happening right now. But if any religion gets into your life and starts to compress you with fear, then your ability to be enlightened and truly see new things pretty much vanishes, right? Well, I'll just give you a choice. Which world do you want to live in? One that matches what we would say and what we often say, even within the constructs of religion, which is God's infinity for all emotions, all forgiveness. If you live in that world, they might even call you secular, non-religious. But it's just you. I mean, if you were to see my patio, and you were to sit here, and I were to say, on this patio, it's just you, me, and our God. There's no preacher here telling you that you gotta get touched to get to God. There's no authority in man on this patio. It's just us kind of sharing ideas. But we are capable of inferring onto God at least what we're capable of doing ourselves, right? Because let's face it, I'm willing to bet 99.9% of all man on this planet has never killed anybody. Oh, you might have thought you wanted to at some point, but you pull your head out, you stop, and you go back to peace. But I'm willing to bet a lot of folks have never been to that level. Oh, they might have been angry, doesn't matter. So overall, the average mean of man is actually pretty good. Why do we ever fight wars? Two things: fake news and bankers, right? Bankers use fake news to drum up a bunch of hate Russia bullshit. As an American, if you're not in America, what's interesting, and I have no idea what the other sentiments in Europe and what have you, but we have been convinced, or at least a lot of people have been convinced in this country, usually baby boomers, that they're supposed to hate the Ruskies forever. There's never supposed to be a place in history where we sort of let all the fake news and revised history melt away. Maybe someone betrayed someone, 80 years ago between the Russians and the U.S. and just a bunch of old farts trying to keep that animosity going on a social level. Now, on a military-industrial complex level, they want to blow up shit. They want to fly their stealth bombers. They make them, and they do not want them just to rot, right? The last thing that they want from a B-2 bomber that costs $2 billion is for it to just sit there and rot. But wouldn't that be the world that God would want? Shouldn't that be the world that we would want? All bullets rot away. All guns rot away. Oh, sure, we can make a bunch of them. Could be a AK-47 in every home in the world. You should just have them strapped to your back. Guess what? Wouldn't be a lot of fights, would there? If we had our way, they'd simply be an ornamental thing for the time that we used to fight. And there's some countries that actually have really interesting, like India and Pakistan have some pretty interesting parades they do where soldiers are carrying, we do it in America too, but you carry these sort of faux rifles. They don't have any chambers in them or anything. They're just sort of wood that's shaped like a gun. Maybe that's probably where we should be. But this wrath of God thing starts to infect the formula as well. The bankers will get war however they can get it. If they can use mass media to take a bunch of secular atheists and make them rationalize some imminent threat, if they can get Kim Jong-un to fake a bunch of missile tests and lie that he's got nuclear weapons and all this crap, they'll use it. But if mass media fails to do it, and if George Soros' Move.org, violent protest that he finances through Craigslist postings, if that doesn't work, they will find a bunch of fundamental Christian preachers. They'll find some sympathetic, more fire and brimstone rabbis, perhaps. They'll find, they'll send Zygmunt Brzezinski, who died, thank God, to go over in Pakistan in the 70s and tell the warlords that they're fighting for their religion, when the warlords are like, what the fuck are you talking about, dude? We don't sit around praying, 5 times a day. We're cutting down poppy seeds and we're selling them. But the bankers aren't stupid. They use religion when it needs to be used. A couple of years ago, I was going to a church with a girlfriend of mine, and it was cool. But every day I went there, I would pick up the little flyer they would print for that week or that day. And it's a little prayer requests and stuff for people who are sick and stuff. And so we do our law of attraction, praying, and we try to help people out, and we send good vibes to them and all that good stuff. But every single one of these little pamphlets talked about various regions of the world where Christians are being persecuted. Obviously, there's nothing good about that, right? But what does that do immediately? through the bloodstream of a Christian. Okay, so they're meddling over there in the Middle East, trying to convert Muslims. Muslims don't want to be converted. They got their own belief system, so they get angry. They also have, in many regions over there, Sharia law, which doesn't matter what religion you have. If you're a woman and you don't have a man to protect you, you're free range, no matter how old you are, old or young. So they incubate. They use these arteries against us. But the wrath of God, when you read these little pamphlets and you hear about the suffering, you might join the military in the name of God to push that over. Because in the back of your brain, you've been taught God rolls like this too. He gets angry. He gets pissed. He kills. He murders his own creations, right? One of the most amazing things you can do when you have a child is to use your relationship with your child to understand your Creator. According to Christianity, which is what I was raised in, God is extremely narcissistic and weak. And they don't tell you, okay, other means of really communicating with God efficiently. It's a Sunday morning ritual, even though it's supposed to be on the Sabbath, which is a Saturday. It's a Sunday morning ritual which we go into a building and we sing and we rejoice and we pray to God. Hey, honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you think about the fact that if you were to say you are having a child, and if you think about us being the children of a creator, because anything that creates life, the parent is the one that created it, right? There's a lot of inanimate objects that we make in this world, and we'll call them our babies. So we'll give them names or something, right? Because we feel that association. We feel that sort of hierarchical metaphor of being the parent of something. But now, would you want your child to treat you the way you treat God? Every Sunday for an hour, your children show up. No matter where they live in the world, they come to you, they sit down in the living room, and they sing praises to you about how amazing you are. It's a Life of Brian episode in your house. Would you not feel that that's pretty fucking weird? Wouldn't that seem strange? I certainly would feel strange if my kid did that to me. And I would do anything in my power to get her to stop. It doesn't mean I don't want to be thanked for something I might have done, but, how many times do you need to hear it? Every Sunday? Wow, that sounds like someone who's got, maintenance issues, doesn't it? But let's go with my friend's definition of God, that he is an angry person. The movie Tron, back in 1982, has an amazing scene in the third act where Jeff Bridges' character, Kevin Flynn, eventually reveals to Tron and Yori, the couple inside the computer, that he is a user. And users are considered gods inside this computer world because it's their creators, right? And Tron turns to Kevin and he goes, well then, if you're a user, then all of this has been done according to a plan. And Flynn just says, you wish. And he's like, I don't understand. He says, well, you know what it's like. You just kind of roll with the punches, man. And he's totally confused. He's not unhappy. Tron's, happy he's met a user. It's cool. But the only way that God gets to be wrathful is if God is really a flawed man. And what's interesting about it would be that, the Bible would have to be literally true. And that God himself was almost a baby when he created the universe. Because we've seen the maturation of God in our own lifespan, right? Or at least in our own, era of, say, 5,000 years they think the world has been alive, right? If you're hardcore Christian literalist, right? Because, he doesn't do that shit anymore, right? We don't have any reports of God telling, well, we do have crazies, but, people that would otherwise be evaluated as completely sane, killing their kids, killing their neighbors, killing their brothers. You have a fanatical clan every once in a while that does build an ark type thing and thinks the end of the world's coming, etc., etc. They pray to graves because they think that someone's going to rise up out of the grave and be the next Messiah, and they're always all let down, right? What was that clan from Asia? I forget where they're from, maybe Korea or something, I can't remember, but they all picked up sold everything they owned in Asia and moved to Texas because they thought the second coming was coming. It's about like 20 years ago or something. But of course they're let down because it's just a guy exploiting everybody. The Raelians. I'm going to do an episode on Raelians. I'm currently reading up on the book. What was his thing? In 1973, he's captured by a UFO, and he is supposed to build an embassy in Jerusalem for the eventual landing of UFOs. Well, nearly 50 years later, I think we can pretty much chalk up the load of horseshit that this guy was trying to put on people. And maybe he's nuts. Maybe he takes ayahuasca like David Icke and he gets a completely different message. At least David Icke isn't saying that there's a return of Christ coming soon, right? But things are pretty quiet now, aren't they? Because we can track history a hell of a lot better than we ever did in the past. You know, what's amazing is if you take the date of the printing press and you move backwards in time, that's where all the gods exist. That's where all this crap exists. That's where God becomes ridiculous and immature and a child. But the second we can record history efficiently, and it was recorded very well in different formats prior to the printing press, and it was recorded as, very imaginative in the Egyptian era. The idol worship in Sumeria was pretty much understood as a metaphorical guide for humanity. A lot of tales back in those days, right? The reason why I make this episode is very simple. We know that we need to rebuild society. We do. It's messed up. It's really messed up. And there's still active factions that are using fake news and a bunch of other PR blitzes to downgrade the morality of man. I mean, it is like they're taking Brave New World and just using it as a manual to destroy humanity. Way outside of any concept of a God, there are humans on Earth that research nothing, know everything, and they want to see the world burn. And so we as mankind have to take responsibility for mankind, for the earth. Because I don't know about you, I don't see God's hands reaching out of the sky to fix things. Hey, that might be kind of cool. What would we learn, though, if God was doing that? I would say we learn kind of the basic principles about what we should have done had God reached down and squash a banker, squish a general trying to start a war, squish some, fake feminist trying to destroy the family. The one thing if we were created to do overall would be to procreate, But if we fix it ourselves, we're going to learn a lot more, don't we? You all know about those subjects that you were interested in as a young person. It was sort of a superficial addiction that you had to something. You wanted to be a pilot. You wanted to be a mechanic. You wanted to be a musician. But the second you pick up the instrument, the wrench, take your flight classes, you understand how serious this stuff is, how difficult it is, and how many levels of mastery that you have to achieve just to be sort of sufficient at the job, let alone an expert at the job. But how many of you have learned a trade with a master that you were learning from, if I might use that term, and they were sort of a cantankerous jerk the entire time? So instead of learning in a peaceful environment and learning as quickly as possible, you were stressed, you were fearful, your mind is preoccupied with getting abused and you're trying to figure out how to do something, so your faculties have already been reduced. Doesn't sound like God to me, does it? Sounds like the ancient world that man tries to define about God. But look at today. No one's messing with us today besides us. We are trying to figure out ways to navigate around it. There's some of you out there that believe that all the guns in the world should be seized. All right. The idea would be that we as a race, as a like a human race, that we would be so intellectual that you could take all the guns because everyone's mind of aggression and greed and this sort of bloodline of command and conquer had vanished from the gene pool of mankind. We have managed to completely intellectualize it out of our minds. But that's not what's happening, is it? Television is teaching everyone to be utterly violent. The internet is teaching people to be sexual deviants, right? I am sure, without knowing any of the real numbers, that the human trafficking today is worse than it's ever been in the history of mankind. And I'm not talking about slavery. I'm talking about, well, I am talking about slavery, but probably more like sexual slaves, boys and girls, right? We know it's happening. But why aren't the police going after these folks? Why isn't it an easy sting operation? If the NSA can look into every single device, every single computer, cell phone, tablet, whatever, why aren't they able to do pattern recognition on every photo on your computer and just find out if you got kiddie porn on your computer? You know, they find a photo on one guy's computer in one particular city in the world, and they put that in the database, and they say, look all over the world for this image. You know, when you use Shazam, which you can find any music just by listening to a few notes, they do a checksum on the song and they can find the match. Well, that's exactly what you can do with an image. Some of you know that there's an image search on Google. Go to google.com, click images. They let you upload an image off your hard drive to find that image everywhere it exists in the world. That technology already exists to this day. So cleaning up all this evil in the world should just be a matter of a global sweep. But no one's even talking about it, are they? They're not even suggesting it. It's because a lot of these fuckers live right at the top. The problem with thinking that God is wrathful is that you almost put God inside a mafia. If we don't have infinite forgiveness and infinite all of this stuff as a goal, we'll never reach it. But if we don't have it as a goal, then this world's going to continue to suck day to day. Because God's wrathful and society's wrathful, cops are wrathful, you'll just map it onto everything. And I don't think anyone deserves to have that classification. As I always say on this show, the whole thing is about making evil stick out like a sore thumb. When I'm on this patio doing an episode, surrounded by green, surrounded by the blue sky and the sun going over on most days, it's godly. It's peaceful. It's beautiful. You guys can hear the birds chirping, right? Yeah, sure, they got predators that they worry about, but most of the time they're singing because they found a safe place. They're up there on the power lines, on the cable lines, they're up in the trees, and they're just chill. They're enjoying each other. Man deserves the same sanctuary. But now imagine you're in a nice room with, 5 walls and a floor, or 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor. But now you think that the fabric of the walls and the floor and the furniture is all a bunch of rules that if you sit down in that chair wrong, you're going to get zapped and fried and potentially forever. What kind of world are you living in, man? I'm not saying you personally, but these people that believe this kind of stuff. Doesn't it sound like a horrible, ungodly frame of mind to be in? I don't think God has built a world that looks like the meat grinder in, Pink Floyd The Wall movie, where the kids are just marching into the meat grinder and, meat's coming out the bottom. I don't think that's God. What would be the point? God doesn't appear to be evil, right? This place can have its wonderful moments. Yeah, we can have definite valleys in our lives that suck, for sure. But in the end, we usually pull out, don't we? Against all odds, time heals absolute. For those of you who hang on to original sin, let's do a little exercise here for your brain. If you believe in original sin, then you believe that there is great distance between you and God unless you're following the Scripture, unless you're going to church, unless you profess God constantly. There's a separation. And you're waiting to die so that you can be judged eventually in some future point when Christ shows up. Be careful getting cremated, right? And then you get to go to heaven. So the entire time you're alive, you're with God, but there's all this man-made distance between you and He, right? All right. That's the game that's been played forever. Now just envision the world for 1 second where you might accept for 1 second or 1 minute that you and God, you're best buds. You're always together. God is always with you, always. Because if God wasn't here, we wouldn't exist. Literally, my atoms wouldn't probably hold together. Something has to actively keep this thing going. And I know I'm talking sort of in a literal, metaphorical way at the same exact time, but just, you know what I'm trying to say, right? Now, for those of you who are atheists, I understand. But even if you go down the physics side of things, the cosmology side of things, there's a lot of evidence that, there's a program running, right? How do you think all the mathematical rules that you worship exist? You could say an is, but once you keep tracking up the food chain, it starts to get to the point where you have to reconcile for the something and the nothing at some point. I want you, if you believe in God, to be as close as you can possibly be to God, leaving no room for man to be between you and God. Now, it might be that, just as an example, you listened to this episode and you got potentially closer to God because you did start to remove these layers of humanity that's been injected into the equation. And so maybe I personally assisted, and again, I'm not trying to do this from an ego standpoint, I'm just as a scientific note to how others can really affect you. I'm not really saying this episode's affecting you, but you might have someone else say something very similar or something completely different, and it brings you closer to God. So it's not that you have to not listen to man to be close to God. But the very first thing I would say is cut everyone out, be with God. Understand you're in the hand of God, if there is one. Right? I believe there is. But that doesn't mean anything. You should make your own decision. And the saddest part about sort of some of the atheists, the philosophers, the writers, the scientists that have said, there is no God, and they feel very puffed up when they do this. Man, I have gotten to a point where I can reject God. Boy, I must be really intelligent. It's not that they're not academically intelligent, but wow. How do you prove something that's unprovable? There's always uncertainty in the soul about such a thing. But they will lose any faith in God because religions destroy it for them. And for me, that's very, very sad. They'll say, someone will ask them, why don't you believe in God? And they'll start quoting out of the Catholic religion or Muslim religion or Jewish religion. Pick a religion. And they'll say, well, that can't be true. Therefore, I totally cut off any association with God whatsoever. And again, I've said it in many episodes in the past that people that were, like George Carlin, the comedian, was raised in a Catholic school system in New York, as I understand it. And he spent a large portion of his last probably 15 to 20 years working into his bit this total lack of belief in God because he needed to completely reject whatever happened to him in those schools. I don't know if he ever confessed any terrible thing, but it sounds to me like he had a bit of a Blues Brothers experience with nuns smacking him and stuff. I don't know. But how sad is it that because God was defined poorly to him, he rejected the whole thing, threw the baby out with the bathwater. This is why I think we need a dialogue about these things. I know you feel me. The reason why I go on with different examples is so that sort of the idea doesn't wiggle out of your mind easily. Right? You might hear a contradicting belief system to your own, and you've heard that before, and so you have a knee-jerk response that someone else gave you or that you thought up that says, no, I've already thought about this, and I still believe in the way I believe because that one thing has this little technical flaw. You're using this word weird, or I'm going to go in the Bible and I'm going to redefine a word to mean something it's not, such that I can fight you on this and I don't have to change inside. Because it took you your whole life to swallow this pill. This religious blue pill. You can keep religion in your life, in my opinion. Just understand what part you're keeping. Again, if you had someone you admired for their skill set, but you didn't like the way that they treated other human beings, but you liked something else mathematical about them, fine, then take what you like about them and leave everything else behind. You can do that with religion all day long. Again, we don't have any secular morality classes that I'm aware of. Because now, again, it's a bad word. You're not allowed to have any ethics. Because someone's going to get butthurt. Some snowflake's going to get butthurt. And so, in order not to offend them, you're not allowed to have any means of ruling your life. right? It's gotten, again, most of you have felt this before, but this bullshit, we can't put boy and girl in a bathroom because a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent are transvestites or something, right? And they get upset when they have to be put in a box according to their genetics. Amen. Man didn't invent man, right? So as part of the fortification of rebuilding society, I think we need to take a long look at religion to see what we get from it, because there's plenty of wonderful things, plenty of wonderful parables that will teach you how to live your life better. Just remember, almost all of them came out of Egypt, which may have actually come out of Sumeria. We're not quite sure. Man has been using metaphor to teach man for thousands and thousands of years. I'm willing to bet if the knowledge we have about Egypt going back at least 40,000 BC is true, then who knows how many hundreds of thousands of years man has been around teaching man how to behave. Who knows when we actually crawled out of the law of the jungle, where the guy with the big stick got to sleep with all the women. It might have been a really long time ago. Now, the other thing is that this message is not for everyone, right? If you feel me on this episode, then this message is for you. If you don't, you probably didn't continue watching in the first place, or they haven't found any of this information anywhere in the world because they're not ready for it, and they may die never being ready for it. So for some, the way to be a good person is to hang on to Christianity, to hang on to Judaism or Muslim beliefs, Islamic beliefs. Fine. It's okay. But I think that we need to spread like a virus the potential that things are much easier than they've ever been. That you've always been close to God and you will always be close to God. Perhaps God has a policy that says, if you don't ask, then I won't mess with your life. But if you do ask, I'm right there for you. You're being sustained second to second, no matter what's going on, right? So something's helping us exist. Again, maybe God set up a simulation, he walks away and he only checks it every once in a while, just like a video game, right? You log into the video game, you do all your little chores, and then you log out, and you may not come back for 6 months, but you come back in and things have continued moving since you were gone. Other people were doing things while you were gone. Perhaps that's our relationship with God, but he set it up in a way that it's sort of fair and that everything can happen to you, good and bad. The more you change your attitude and pick your friends carefully and construct your life, the better life you have. The more perhaps innate abilities that you've been given to study and become an expert at something, it feeds your life. So it's almost like you've been given all of the equipment, all of the tools to get yourself out of whatever mess you're in. It's just up to you to go for it. And shit happens, right? People get hurt that shouldn't be hurt. People get sick who shouldn't be sick. But if you think about it, why do people catch cancer in this world? Because we are looking the other way when the FDA pushes through a bunch of cancer-causing stuff or allows a bunch of crappy food to be put into our food system. GMOs, chemtrails, whatever it is, right? We don't have all the answers. We just know that some things make us sick. On a slight digression before I sign off here, I checked out the obituary in my hometown, and I always tell you guys that the people in my hometown are either sort of in their 60s or they're in their 90s and 100s when they die, or late 80s. And the lesson to be learned there is the older people didn't buy into the refined sugars and the margarine and all this produced food. They go and shop at a grocery store and they bring it home and they cook it. And they get to live into their 90s and 100s. But the younger generation, probably your baby boomers, it seems as if they're sort of been duped into a self-extermination. And this is why we have to change the algorithm of the world. In so many areas, it's countless. All right, I've gone on too long. Go to deepthoughtsradio.com for all the feeds. There's video if you're on audio, it's on audio if you're on video. iTunes and Google Play have the commercial arteries for the podcast, but if you just have a mobile device, you can go to deepthoughtsradio.com. There's a little icon that pops up in the lower right. Click that from your mobile device. It'll find the podcast player on your phone if you have one. Vid.me has nearly all the seasons. Nearly all the episodes. It's about 5 episodes behind YouTube. I think YouTube has a larger community. But Season 1 on vid.me is perfect. Season 1 on YouTube is blocked in several countries because of music I put at the beginning. Some of the audio is completely blocked. So if you want to see Season 1 in its pristine condition, go to vid.me in your web browser, or there's a vid.me player for your telephone. It's a pretty cool crowd. They're usually, a lot shorter videos on there, but if you know what you like, you can dial the Deep Thoughts Radio and you'll find it. I say you're very close to God. I say you're as close as you can possibly be to God without transcending out of your mortal coil and becoming spiritual, becoming pure consciousness. I don't know what's after this life, but I'm willing to bet it's pretty cool. I bet it's pretty cool. I think you create your own hell, so be careful with your life. Be good to people. Become empathetic. Become sympathetic. And I think your life will be a wonderful place. But we also have to take action. We have to spread the word of goodness around this world to make bad things stand out. Yes, some bad things are subjective. Some bad things are cut and dry. Let's go for the cut and dry ones first, and I think that the rest will sort itself out. We're in a renaissance where we're going back in time in terms of our standards. We're sick and tired of everything being unraveled, right? Everything we've worked hard for in society to preserve society and feed society, we're allowing a very tiny, tiny single percent, if not a fraction of a single percent of people who have their artery through mass media, fake news, to convince us to release the death grip on what works and what doesn't work. Take care of yourself and somebody else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.